probably up until, perhaps in the 1980s of the last century. And then things got rather more interesting. Scholars of various stripes began to look at the book differently. They began to hear it differently. And I want to share with you one now, a guy named Norman Habel, H-A-B-E-L, who wrote a big commentary on Job in the Westminster Commentary series in 1985. Now, one of the reasons I was attracted to this book is that he knew my dissertation. He was the first person, I think, in the history of the world who had read my dissertation, including my advisor. But nonetheless, he found my dissertation rather interesting, and he played off of it some and used it some and agreed with some and disagreed with some, but he spent some time with it. I was really quite astonished, actually. And I've never met Norman Habel, although I've read most of his stuff. He's very interesting. He's an Australian guy. And Habel reads the book rather like this. First, he says, God's personal appearance to Job is what Job both desired and feared. You remember he says in chapter 9, Job says, if God were to show up, I think God would not listen to anything that I say. He would ask me a whole bunch of questions that I couldn't possibly answer. And that's exactly what happens. God shows up, asks a lot of questions Job can't answer. And so now he is both, he wants to meet God, but not like that. But that's what he gets. Elihu, we looked at him briefly last week, you remember, warned that no mortal could see God and live in chapter 34, verse 23. And yet, lo and behold, that's not what happens at all. God shows up and Job's very much alive. A direct revelation, a private revelation of an evil person is unthinkable. And all the friends believe this, and certainly Elihu believes it and says it. We expect perhaps, says Habel, a traditional silence of God, but we're all very surprised that God is not silent at all. God has an awful lot to say and says it in some really quite grand poetry. God, when God shows up, God does not specify charges against Job at all, but presents the case that God wants to make with Job out of the storm, of course, and challenges Job, as we will see, to reveal wisdom. If you think you're so wise, Job says, God, then show me what you know. And so the questions are precisely, Habel says, God's defense against Job's claims and accusations. You want to accuse me of being an awful, monstrous figure in the universe? Let me show you what I do in the universe. And so you get in these speeches God's control and use of wind and weather, and God's nurturing and keeping animals alive in the universe. So we'll say more about that later. Basically the three sentences that are most important for Habel are: God accuses Job of obscuring or darkening the design of the universe. Chapter 38, verse 2. If you have your Bible there, you will see most times that word is translated counsel. Who is this who obscures or darkens counsel? But the word can also be translated design, and I think that's a better translation. Habel certainly thinks it is. So chapter 38, verse 2 and chapter 40, verse 8, God accuses Job of darkening counsel, of obscuring the design of the universe. And secondly, in chapter 40, verses 9 to 14, and these are going to be important words, in particular my reading, as I'll try to describe that in a moment, that God asks Job, commands Job, if you think I operate like that, if you think I tread down the wicked, then you do it. You tread down the wicked, show me. In other words, God demands that Job act as Job thinks God acts. And I'm going to say more about that when I get to my own particular reading, but this is where Habel is. He thinks these are very important parts of the speech of God. God's defense operates from the assumption, says Habel, that Job is innocent, but he's ignorant. Doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, And certainly nobody can deny that when God begins to ask these questions about where were you, and surely you know this, and the answer is, of course, he didn't know anything like that at all. Job's obsession with his own integrity, says Hobble, is not the key to understanding the universe. It's not Job's integrity that's in the center of everything. The issue is God's integrity, says Hobble, as the creator of a very complex world. So what God's speeches, says Hobble, reveal is the complexity of the universe. And that, says Hobble, is God's answer to Job's demand for vindication. In the face of that claim that God makes, Job retracts his legal case. Remember, he's talked over and over again about wanting to meet God in a courtroom. But in chapter 42, verses 1 to 6, his final response, Job's final response, he retracts his legal case and sets aside, says Hobble, his formal demand for vindication. God's speech then is a defense against his rival and his accuser. And here's how Hobble puts it in his own commentary. In a world where paradox and incongruity are integral to its design, now get that, he believes that God is revealing a universe that's filled with paradox and incongruity, both of which are integral to the design of the universe. There is no simplistic answer to the problem of innocent suffering. Don't imagine this book is going to answer that question, because it doesn't. It certainly doesn't. And I agree with that. I think that's right. The baby eagle, he says, in chapters 39, as we see those, survives because another young creature dies. That's the fact of it. Nature really is red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson said, and that's certainly the case in these speeches of God. God does not eliminate the forces of chaos, nor the role of death, nor the presence of the wicked. God's not in that business of eliminating all that stuff. Those things operate within the eternal constraints of God's design. Light is balanced by darkness. Each night, says the speech, the wicked function, but each dawn they are exposed and they are contained. Chapter 38, verses 12 to 15. No mechanical law of reward and retribution operates in a design like this. The wasteland is as much God's concern as the rain that breaks the drought in chapter 38, verse 26, 27. I'm going to come back to those verses in a minute. For there is a celebrative aspect to the world which puts all structural and functional features into perspective. In God's design, there is a measure of the comic with the controlled, the bizarre with the beautiful, the serendipitous with the serious. I like that. It's nice, nicely written, I think. Job's complaint that the innocent suffers unjustly is never refuted. God doesn't refute that. It stands side by side with the answers of Yahweh as part of the paradox of God's design. Yahweh's theophanic appearance honors Job. God's speech challenges Job. God's enigmatic design throws Job back into a bewildering world of wonder. In that world, Job reluctantly forgoes his demand for litigation. So that brings us up to, according to Hobble, the final 10 verses of the book from chapter 42, 7 to 17, that very uncomfortable and difficult ending. And this is what Hobble says about that. In chapter 42, verse 7, if you have your Bible, look at that one. This is where God says to the friends, particularly to Eliphaz, "You have not spoken to me what is right, like my servant Job." The bluntness of Job out of his agony is closer to the truth, God says, than the conventional, unquestioning pronouncements of the friends. God would rather have a loudmouth questioner than a bunch of namby-pamby know-it-alls any day. And for me, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that the loss of the book of Job from most Christian churches and from most synagogues too, I might add, is in many ways, this is the hardest and most difficult loss of all. The fact that prayer can also be agonized complaint and fury and questioning and the refusal to knuckle under to simple answers. That is a significant part of the gift of the book of Job. Certainly to me it has been, and I think it could be to many people in churches and synagogues through the years. Ironically enough, then, Holbert goes on to say that that's the first part of the epilogue, is that little section where God rejects the friends' comments and then asks them to sacrifice and ask Job to pray on their behalf. Job becomes the mediator for the friends that he sought. You remember what Job wanted? He wanted an umpire, he wanted a mediator, he wanted somebody to stand between him and God. And now God asks Job to become the mediator for the friends, which he does. Job's restoration then, and this is very important, and I'm going to talk more about this when I get to my particular reading of it. Job's restoration is an act of grace. It's not a reward for his integrity or his achievements as some kind of hero. It has nothing to do with that at all. And if you read it like that, and I found this very impressive for Hubble. I don't agree with everything that he says here, but I do think he's got a hand on something. It's very important. The end of the book is not a rejection of what the whole book has been saying, quite the opposite. It says quite directly exactly what the book has been saying, that God does not operate in some kind of tit for tat reward punishment way at all. God operates out of a kind of grace-filled sense of the strangeness and peculiarities of the universe. Now, notice Hubble also says at the end of the book, what do you have? You've got a domestic world again. You've got a world where everybody's together, they're all having a picnic, they all bring some money to Job, Job gets rich again, Job has a family again. It doesn't at all undercut the horror of the beginning of the book, not in the slightest. But it does say at the end that the world is reconstituted. And we're going to say much more about that when we get to it with another reading that I'm going to give you now. Okay, that's Hubble's understanding of this in a very brief compass. It's a really interesting commentary and I think well worth reading. Now let me give you the third one. This is a guy named David Kleins, and David Kleins taught his whole career at the University of Sheffield in England. Sheffield became, ironically enough, and Sheffield is the north of England. It's in the middle of the collieries of the coal industry. Sheffield was a tough, remains a kind of tough working class town. Right in the middle of this town is the University of Sheffield, which is quite an extraordinarily progressive university, and particularly in its religion department. They have some amazing people there. David Gunn, who's a friend, taught there for many years. And these are people who are really progressive in their understanding of biblical things. And Kleins wrote this enormous commentary on Job. Most people thought he would never finish it because he got very ill in the middle, but he survived and finished the whole thing. It is over 1,500 pages long, and it's in sometimes 6-point type. So that'll tell you something how long this is. I mean, it is enormous, but it is fascinating. It's really fascinating and, surprising enough, quite radical in its understanding of Job in a very different way. And I want to share that a little bit with you to show you how interesting you can read this book in ways that I had never thought of myself at all. Klein says at the end, Yahweh, God, is the master architect of the world, creating the world with a mysterious physical structure and filled with all manner of strange life forms, all of which, note, are beyond human comprehension. All of the animals that are listed in the second part of God's first speech are animals that have nothing to do with humans at all. Even the war horse, which is mentioned, is not an animal that human beings control. The war horses stamps and rolls, and he's out of control most of the time, according to the description of him. But every other animal, the raven, the eagle, the lion, the ostrich, all of them are clearly creatures that only God deals with, only God takes care of, only God feeds, and you and I have nothing to do with it at all. Now that many commentators now say that, because that means, of course, then what God is, at least one of the things God is saying to Job is that you, Job, are not the most important thing in the universe. You are not in the center of things. You may think you are, and you're acting like you are, but you're not. Certainly one of the things God wants to say is that, and I think that's certainly right. In God's first speech, says Kleins, God absolutely ignores Job's concern. And that's certainly true. I mean, Job asks for vindication and God talks about ostriches. But what does that have to do with vindication? The fact is, very little, if anything. The second speech, says Kleins. Now, here's where Kleins really goes in a very different direction than I go. Kleins says that the second speech of God, the one after Job responds by saying, I've spoken once, but I will go on no further, in chapter 40, verses 6, 7, and 8. And God then speaks again, gird up your loins like a warrior, says God, the same thing that God says at the beginning. And what Kleins calls this speech is, quote, an unattractive baiting of Job, a sarcastic challenge to him to dress up like a god and to act like the kind of God that Job expects the universal ruler to be. These are the verses, chapter 40, verses 7 to 14. And I'm going to come back to those in just a moment in my own thing. Feel free, Kleins says God is saying, feel free to rule that way if you want to. But it's not my way of managing the universe. I don't do that at all. You can do that if you want. You can try that for a while. See what you think. See if you tread down some wicked in their place. Go ahead. If that's what you think I do, go ahead and do it. So Kleins finds that a sarcastic challenge from God to Job. And then in the second part, the second speech of God after that initial challenge in chapters 40, verse 7 to 14, then you get what Kleins thinks is the most important verse in the speeches of God. And that is chapter 40, verse 15. Because suddenly God says, look at Beomath. Now, Kleins, and I agree with him, knows and thinks that Beomath is not the hippopotamus. You might have a translation that even says that. No, this is not the hippopotamus. Beomath is a mythological creature from the Canaanite culture. We have this mentioned to us in Canaanite mythological texts. Beomath is the great creature of the land, a great monster who lives below the surface of the ground and who arches his back. And when he arches his back, there are earthquakes. That's how the ancients imagined in their mythological thinking how earthquakes occurred. It's because Beomath was arching his back below the ground. But verse 15, you notice in chapter 40 says what? This moves from Job's ignorance to the proper perspective of the universe, says Kleins. Job needs a better knowledge. Here, the didactic part of the book where we're teaching and teaching and teaching has given place to the lyrical part, moving toward Yahweh's special concentration on Leviathan, whom Kleins thinks is the crocodile. I think he's wrong. I don't think Leviathan's the crocodile at all. I think Leviathan is another mythological creature, and we certainly have Leviathan mentioned in many other places in the Hebrew Bible. Psalm 104, the beginning of several other Psalms mention the great creature who lives in the bottom of the ocean and rises up and swallows ships and is a dangerous, huge, massive creature. But somehow Kleins imagined this to be the crocodile. Didacticism, says Kleins, has left no room for wonder. We've got to get away, says Kleins, with all that teaching stuff. We got to get to the poetry. So here's the poetry. But here's the problem, says Kleins, and this is what gets really interesting to me. Should we not be wary of poets who sweep questions of justice under the carpet of delight. Ooh, I like that. That's a good phrase. Shouldn't we be leery of poets that sweep questions of justice under the carpet of delight? And Kleins thinks that's what's happening. He thinks that the poet of the speeches of God is trying to cover over the issues of justice by giving us glorious poetry. Very interesting. Job's reply about Yahweh's speeches in the last of his speeches, chapter 42, verses 1 to 6, admits readily that God can do everything. Job never denied that. Job knew that God was powerful and never denied it at all. But does that mean more than might is right with you? Is that all Job is saying, that because God has all the power, God has all the right, God can do whatever God wants? Job accepts the marvels of God, but the question of justice is still unanswered. It's absolutely unanswered, and that's absolutely right. It is unanswered. When he says he has heard and seen Yahweh, my eye sees you. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Kleins thinks that phrase is what he calls, quote, a stunning rejection of the divine speeches, a complete rejection of God's meteorological interests and zoological interests. Job ends his case, but not because he's satisfied. Oh, no, he's not satisfied at all, quite unlike what Holbert says. He is now convinced that his case will never be heard. Never. Job is neither triumphant, says Kleins, nor is he defeated. Job's doubling of his fortune at the end in the epilogue is no recompense for heaven's unprovoked attack. I mean, we shouldn't feel really good about this because of that attack that God did through the Satan at the beginning of this whole story. But it is, says Kleins, interestingly, a recognition of the injustice of it. That initial attack, says Kleins, was unjust. God should not have acted that way. And the end of the book, he says, makes that very clear. No more theology, says Kleins, comes out of Job's mouth. No, he's no longer a theologian. No, because the focus of the story, says Kleins, has moved from the grand cosmic design to a kind of small domestic plane. And here's what he says in his own words at the end of his particular understanding of all this. Even the fundamental questions about God and the universe, the author seems to be saying, however pressing, however distressing, have their own context in a world where human life goes on regardless, eating, drinking, begetting, dying. There is more to life than justice, more perhaps even than theology in general. However insatiable the human spirit might be for answers, however oppressed it may be by injustice, yet the big questions that come of their own accord will not go away. And he concludes, you can't live with them and you can't live without them. And that's the last line of his old commentary after 1,500 pages of reading the book. Wasn't that intriguing? It's a very different way of seeing things altogether, I'd say. Let me give you a little bit of what I think. And it's a kind of a combination, I think, of some of these. I certainly learned a great deal from Holbert when I read his commentary, but I've got some other things that to me are very important. I think there are, for me at least, three things that need to be said about what we learn from the speeches of Yahweh and what we learn from the end of the book. First, Job is decentered. I think Holbert's got that certainly right. That Job's single-minded focus on his own injustice and integrity is finally not what really counts, according to this author. It's important, it's significant, it's painful, it's agonizing. And as Holbert says, I wish there were easy answers to it, but there aren't. There aren't. So Job is pushed off the center of creation by the speeches of God. And that I don't think anybody could deny that. Secondly, we learn from the speeches of God that the universe is far from mechanical. It's not a kind of bumper sticker God that we're dealing with, a God that rewards and punishes, as the Friends have said, as Elihu has said. It's not that kind of God at all, but a God who is, as a matter of fact, the universe filled with ferocious weather and strange creatures. In other words, the universe that you and I live in is very odd and very mysterious. It's gritty and dark and wonderful and strange and peculiar and marvelous and all of that together. Instead of trying to bring the universe down to a recognizable, acceptable way of thinking, it explodes it all openly. Now, I want to recommend a book to you to read, which really helped me get clearer about this. And you probably read this book. I hope you have. If you hadn't, I'd rush right out and do it right away. It's the famous Pulitzer Prize winning book by the marvelous writer Annie Dillard. It was published in 1974. It's almost 50 years old now. It's called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. It's a marvelous book. It describes in better detail than anything I've ever read about the strangeness of the universe in which you and I live. It's very peculiar. What Dillard does is she herself goes to a creek in Virginia and spends 9 months there, through several seasons, through the winter, into the spring, and she observes. And she takes with her several books. She's got a book about insects, she's got a book about birds, she's got a book about rivers, and she watches all day long. Things happen around her. She makes a few notes. She goes back to her cabin by herself and she thinks about it. She reads some things about insects and birds and then begins to speculate about what this says about the world in which she finds herself. I found the book revelatory. I think it's some of the finest prose I've ever read, and I think it's really one of the great books of the last half century. And I would urge you to read that. It's a good read, a thrilling read. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. It's an amazing, amazing book. And I think it makes this point that the world is filled with ferocious weather and strange creatures, and nothing works so mechanically at all. It just doesn't. Let me give you one example of what she says. She observes a passage of a huge body of insects, thousands of them, and she watches them cross the little creek. That's only several feet wide by where she is at a certain point in the creek. And the insects, many of them drown. Hundreds drown in this creek. Meanwhile, some of the insects are walking on the backs of these drowning other insects. They're just marching along, and enough of them get to the other side to continue the species. Thousands of them have died. And she asked the question, is this any way to run a railroad? to sacrifice thousands of a species so the species can live? Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it raises a horde of issues and questions about, is the universe so simple? It's not simple. And that's what her writing has helped me see so much. So that's certainly what I think God is saying to Job, for sure. That's why all of these images of weather are given the way they are, and it's why the images of the animals are given the way they are. Now, I would also say then, as I said earlier, that chapter 40, verse 8 is the key, I think, to the first speech, even though it's in the second speech, but it's the first speech, because I don't think, let's look at those lines that how Job responds to God. God gives that long first speech, about wind and weather and animals and all of that stuff in chapters 38 and 39. And then Job responds in chapter 40, as follows. Job answered the Lord, "See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth." That's the way the Hebrews say he's going to say nothing else ever again. He's put his hand on his mouth. "I've spoken once, I will not answer. Twice, I proceed no further." That's it. You win. That's the end of it as far as I'm concerned. I got nothing else to say. You've said what you want to say. I've said what I'm going to say. And you're big and powerful. I've been saying that from the beginning, and nothing is good about it at all. And so then God, no, that's not good enough. There has to be more than that. And so God answers Job again in chapter 40, verse 6. Verse 7 says exactly the same thing that God says in the first speech. "Gird up your loins like a man." My NRSV reads, the word really means warrior, hero. "I will question you and you declare to me." But now listen to verse 8. This is the key. "Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me so that you can be justified?" And I think if you've read this book, you know Job's answer to that question. Yes, you got it right. You have been listening. That's what I've been saying. You're wrong and I'm right. I mean, that's the point of the whole book. And then now remember what Kleins and I think Holbert also say about these next verses, beginning in verse 9. They think it is, Klein says it's a sarcastic challenge. I disagree. I don't think the challenge is sarcastic at all. As a matter of fact, I read these lines rather like this. I think God is in a kind of playful mood now. And God realizes that Job is struggling to understand the things that God has said to Job in chapters 38 and 39. And so God now plays a little game with Job. "Okay, Job, if you think I really do act the way you think I act, that I tread down the wicked in their place, I deck myself with majesty and pour out my anger all over the world, then I'm going to stand over here on the side and I'm going to watch you do it. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. I'll wait. Come on, tread down a few wicked." I think it's a kind of whimsical way that God has at this point of saying to Job, "Look, you can't do that, but neither do I. I don't do that. That's not the business I'm in. I'm not in the business of treading down wicked people. I don't do it. I just don't." I mean, you've said this over and over again. In chapters 21 and 23, you said the wicked prosper. Sometimes they do. You're absolutely right. I don't do the things you think I do at all. And then, after that whimsical little challenge to Job, God says, "Okay, let me show you something that I think you need to look at." And the way I describe it in my play is that the door of heaven swings open a little bit, and out lumbers the gigantic figure of Beomath. Beomath, and I would translate that word, the beast, with a capital B. This is the beast, the land beast. "Look at Beomath, which I made, just as I made you." And there it is in many ways. If what God is saying to Job is the whole universe in its mystery and surprise and wonder is part of what you are living in. And that's what you've got. And that's what I've got. This is you and I together, Job, are in the struggle in this particular universe that I have created, that I am involved with and still am involved with. And so are you. It's not me against you and you against me. It's all of us together. We're all in this together, Job. And then God turns to another creature lumbering out of the throne room of heaven, and it's Leviathan. It's the great twisting serpent of the sea that the Canaanites also talked about. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? Well, of course not. I mean, Leviathan's a monster. Leviathan, like Beomath, is part of the universe. It is part of the universe in which we all live together. So when you get to the end of God's second speech, and then Job responds, and let's look at that together because it's very important how this is translated. I'm astonished by the NRSV's translation, which is desperately wrong. I don't know where they got this. I really don't. Here's how it goes, chapter 42, verse 2. I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. That's certainly true. Job's been saying that from the beginning. Doesn't change his mind about that. Now he quotes God. God said, who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Yeah, you're right. I got that one. Okay. Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand. Things too astonishing, too amazing for me, which I didn't know. Yeah. You see, God's appearance to Job and all that God said to Job about the universe, Job now he gets it. He understands how ignorant he really was of the whole thing. And now he quotes God again, verse 4. You said, here, I'll speak to you and I'll question you and you declare to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear. All that stuff about rewards and punishments. I mean, I grew up on that stuff. That's what I learned at my mother's knee. We all learned that. The friends know that. Elihu knows that. I know that. But now my eye sees you. And now comes the important line, verse 6, which the NRSV, the old RSV said basically the same thing, and the NRSV has not changed it. I despise myself. That is ludicrous and completely in error. If you have an NRSV in front of you, you have my permission to scratch that out with a pen and never think like that again. It's a ridiculous translation. This word doesn't mean that at all. I frankly don't know where they got this. I really don't. What it seems to say is, therefore I recant, or I change my, all that stuff that I said before. Nah, I was wrong. I was ignorant. I spoke out of ignorance. I did. I admit that. And the word repent here is not the typical Hebrew word to repent is the word shuv. It means to turn around. This is not that word. This is the word nicham. And nicham means to change one's mind, to be in a different frame. I change my mind on dust and ashes. Job is now ready to live in the world again, but it's certainly not the same world. Not before God showed up. Not before God revealed this astonishingly mysterious universe that Job is now living in. And that's why the end of the book, the last 10 verses, verses 7 to 17, 11 verses, I think can be very important for understanding the book, because this world described to us here is the new world of God and the new world of Job. And notice how new it is. Now, again, translations are important. One of the most difficult lines is verse 10 of chapter 42. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job, watch this, when he prayed for his friends. No, that is not what that says. It's not because he prayed for his friends that he gets the goodies again. No. All it says is, there's just a typical connector there in Hebrew. All it says is, God restored the fortunes of Job, and Job prayed for his friends. That's what it says. Because there's no direct tit for tat for Job's prayer or Job's integrity or Job's wisdom or none of that stuff. God operates at the end of this book right out of the grace of God, and that's all there is to it. That when it says, God says to the friends, you've not spoken right about me like a misservient Job, as I've already described that to you, what I think that means, that Job's honest anger and frustrations, God would much rather have that than the kind of pious friend nonsense that they've been saying for all this time. And so everybody, they sacrifice, they pray, they have a picnic together. And then to indicate how new the world is, suddenly Job names 3 daughters. The sons don't get names at all. And not only names the daughters, but gives them property, which in Numbers 21, we are told that women never got property unless there were no male heirs. Well, there are 7 male heirs here. None of them get it. The girls get it. It is a new world. Now, I'm not suggesting that the author is saying, by saying all this, that we ought to change the world in certain ways. But what the author, I think, is saying is that the world is no longer the same in the mind of Job and in our minds. It's a different place. It's a better place, a possible place, I think. So that's how I tend to read it now. I used to read it differently than that. My dissertation read it differently than that, but that's how I hear it for at the moment anyway. And it's certainly, as I said, Hubble, Kleins, the tradition, my reading, and I could give you another 100 of them, have different nuances and different ways of thinking about it. But now, in the time we have left, I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you think. And I asked the question last week, what did you want God's speech to say? And obviously why. And now, how do you understand what God says? Okay, let's have at it. Just start talking.
John, let me jump in and disagree with part of what you've said, and that has to do, and is probably you're using the word and I'm using the word in a little different way. But one thing that I got from listening to you and reading the scriptures and checking with some other sources was that there is, I believe, in Job a distinction between nature outside of humankind and humankind and our community. And I think the notion of justice and morality just does not apply to nature. And so I would say that actually nature is very mechanical. And this mechanical cause and effect and survival of the fittest and Darwinian evolution all kind of function on certain natural laws. And that's part of God's creation. But there's also the human community, which we're a part of. And I agree with you that Job, the book of Job reminds us that creation is a lot more complicated and involves a lot more than human community. So, that I absolutely agree. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around a God, and I think this is quite an accurate description of God, but a God who apparently in other parts of the Bible cares about justice, cares about fairness, but does not exercise divine power to bring it about. And so another way of reading what one of the commentators thought was sarcasm and what you thought was more playfulness, maybe, and I know I'm really reaching here, is an invitation for us to, at least in the way we can, step into the role of God, which is to the extent that we can oppose injustice, we should do so. At the same time, God's saying, good luck with that. That's a very tough project. That's not one that you're going to necessarily succeed at. But those are some thoughts that come to my mind.
Good, I like it. No, I like that possibility. I think it's very interesting, and I would not rule it out at all from the possibility of those verses in chapter 40, verses 7 to 14 are really interesting and very intriguing and have been read. I like this reading as a possibility. It's a kind of a call for us to be involved. Try it, Job, if you can. As you say, it's going to be tough. If you think you can do it easily, have at it, but it's not an easy game to play. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Okay, anybody else?
I want to thank you for what you've said there about the ending and it being a new world. I've always been a bit bothered by, and then Job gets everything back and everybody lives happily ever after, because he had tragedy happen. He lost his children. There is no recovery. I mean, there is loss. But I think if we haven't gone through suffering, I think we all have, know people who have lost people, thought you couldn't go on, but then life goes on. You find a way to go on. And I was thinking what you were saying there at the end, kind of applies to where we are right now as we're emerging from this pandemic. It's not going to be the same.
No.
It's,
Right.
we have endured a time of difficulty and we're going to a new world. And if we expect it's going to be the same at that it was, we're going to be sorely disappointed. So, I think in that sense, this is, a word for those who have endured suffering, is that eventually the suffering will be past and you go on, but it's not going to be the same.
Yeah, that's a good comment, Nora. I like that. And I also say, I think you're absolutely right about this, and I certainly agree, that the ending of the book does not solve the problem that we started with at all. It doesn't say, well, now we understand why God did this with the Satan and Job. No, we don't understand that at all. It happened. And it is real, and it is real suffering, and it remains real suffering. But it doesn't mean then that it's in and of itself meaningless. And that's where the tricky part comes. Now, Kleins, as I said, and others with him, I might add, read this in a very dark way. They imagine that since the book doesn't solve any of these problems, then essentially you're left with very little in terms of thinking about what you should now be or do in this new world of God. I just don't agree with that. The end of the book, verses 7 to 17, chapter 42, many scholars just leave that out. They think, oh, some idiot wrote this who wanted to end the fairy tale in a certain kind of way. And gosh, let's not even think about that. Well, I just don't think that's right. I think that there's more happening at the end of the book than they want to admit or are willing to see. And I suggest that it is a new world. I'm not saying it solves our problems at all. It does not. But it does, as Klein says, I think helpfully, we move from a kind of focus on our own justice to a kind of lyrical sense of the universe. And then that may not be such a terrible thing. I mean, Reg is certainly right. The universe described in the book of Job is a dark universe of tooth and claw redness. There's no doubt about that at all. And the storms and wind and cloud and rain and all that stuff. It's the way we find ourselves in the universe, and we shouldn't downplay that at all. And also, he is right to say that we are not thereby forced into thinking mechanically about our own lives. As he puts it quite rightly, other places in the Hebrew Bible don't say that at all. The prophets particularly are intent on commanding justice and saying that God commands justice from us. So it's not as if the author of this book doesn't know that, but I do think the author's attempt is to clear the decks of that simple thinking. Yes, nature is the way that it is, all right, but human beings are not that way. We are not rewarded and punished because of things we do. We do not control the actions of God by our behaviors. That's just not the way it is. It doesn't work that way at all. Now, whether or not he comes clean to us with a very different way of seeing, viewing God, that's another question. I think there's a kind of openness at the end of the book, which isn't fully satisfactory for those of us who like answers. But it does continually raise us to think again and again, to question, to ask, to refuse to knuckle under to these persons who keep telling us that there are easy answers to these questions. There are no easy answer to these questions. And Job's author, I think, is helping us all the time. Stay there, be in there. Now, for some people, that's uncomfortable. I grant that. People want answers. Who doesn't want an answer? But that's not what Job's going to give you. No simple responses are possible. Okay? Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
Becky.
I'm sorry? Okay.
Becky first, yeah. I
Okay.
saw her hand.
Fine.
Becky, yep.
So in the Christian agnostic,
Mhm.
White, was that the author?
What?
Remember.
I don't know. Whitehead, maybe?
Whitehead.
Whitehead, yeah.
He,
Alfred North, yeah.
Weatherhead.
Weatherhead, Leslie Weatherhead. Thank you.
Thank you. He describes God as a giant, and we humans are little ants,
Yep.
and we can't possibly begin to
Mhm.
understand the giant from our perspective. So I'm reminded of that.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, if you would comment a little more about the pandemic, because that seems to be a good example of the universe doing its thing in spite of all us current scientific humans. And what do we do with that? And where is God? You know?
Yeah, it certainly did that. No doubt about it at all. I was in the gym today and I met a guy there. I'm in the YMCA. It's slowly opening back up again, and not many people were there today. But I was talking to this guy, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, isn't it wonderful to be able to come back now and work out again and be involved in this?" Yeah, that's exactly right. And then he said, "Well, it's been a long time, but there was a reckoning." Well, that's an interesting word, isn't it? A reckoning. Now, this guy was an African American. So certainly he was talking about racial reckoning, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And certainly that's true. I mean, we are, whatever the pandemic did, it certainly got us back into the racial reckoning in a very powerful way. But not just that, it also showed us up as a tremendously divided group. Here we are now, breaking out of the pandemic. I mean, I went to the gym today without a mask. I worked out without a mask. I took a shower without a mask. I mean, I had the thing off. I didn't take one with me. So it's certainly a new day that way here. But I know in California, there are plenty of unvaccinated people and for all kinds of reasons. And I know there are those who still don't want to get vaccinated. And I also know that in Brazil, 2% are vaccinated, or in India, about 3% are vaccinated. And I know that we've taken care of our country as well as we can, and we've got a whole lot of vaccine around. People can get it. You go to the grocery store now, it's available in the grocery store, for heaven's sakes. You can have a shot. What that means is, though, there's a reckoning going on. There's a kind of sharp division that's now been thrown at us by this. And the sharp division, I think, can't be avoided. It's not the same world that it was. I don't think we can any longer imagine that things are the way they were. They are not the way they were for all kinds of reasons. But I think part of that was the pandemic, no question. And certainly the murder of George Floyd and all of the other things that have happened to us. But sure, it brought some reality. Now, Becky's question is, where's God in all this? Well, according to the book of Job, where God is in all this, is that God is the creator of Beomath and Leviathan. And as Isaiah puts it in a rather sharper way in chapter 45, verse 7, I am the Lord, beside me there is no other. I make weal and I create woe.
Oh.
Now that's dark for those of us who don't want to imagine that God is engaged somehow in the painful side of the universe. But I think the author of Job is led there by his conviction that God operates in ways that are beyond us, mysterious. And back to Weatherhead's comment about giants and ants. The thing I would say that's different about the author of Job than Weatherhead is that the ants have every right and duty to keep questioning the giant. The giant can't get away with this. The giant can't be let off the hook all the time. We can't just let God do whatever God wants and just say, oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just get me again. No, what Job says is, I'm not having this. I'm not willing to accept this simplistic notions that the friends have said. It's not enough for me. It's not satisfactory to me. So Job receives from God the revelation that the world is a very strange place. And for him, that appears to be enough. But it's not the end. Because I'll bet after he's having a picnic with the buddies there, he's probably, as much as Kleins like to say they're not talking theology anymore, well, not publicly, but I bet they're still talking theology. I bet they're still after one another in terms of what God is doing. How can we understand what God is doing? I think that's what it means. What's so wonderful about being in a community of faith that don't all agree with one another is that we are kept at this task, the theological task, asking why, what, questions that simply don't have easy responses. And for me, that's grand. I mean, that's faith for me is the chipping away of the diamond. It's not the diamond. It's the chipping that counts. But that's not for everybody. I know that. Not for everybody. That's why the majority of people read this book very differently than I do, for sure. And I'm perfectly comfortable letting them read it that way. I just don't hear it that way. I just don't. Okay, anybody else? Nancy? Mm-hmm.
So if this is the last word on what God is like, and I'm not ready to give in on that one, then where does prayer fit in? I mean, when bad things happen. Yep. And part of our job is to find meaning in it so that it's not a disaster. Mm-hmm. But then that's why you pray. You pray for guidance, you pray for understanding, you pray for what do I do next? Why did this happen to me, Lord, is not a good prayer. But what can I do about this? It seems to me is a reasonable prayer.
Yeah,
I think God is busy with Leviathan and Beomath.
Yeah, right.
Is God listening?
That's a good question. I think that's exactly the question the author of Job would ask. How does prayer work now? Well, I may tell you a little story of a friend of mine who's a very unusual character. He was a pastor of the church on Peaks Island in Maine. His name was Gary Chamberlain. He had a PhD in the Hebrew Bible from Boston. He was a brilliant guy, but he never wanted to teach. He wanted to be a pastor. So he pastored Peaks Island in Maine. During the winter at Peaks Island, there are about 20 people on the whole island. In the summer, there are 4,000 or 5,000 tourists, who show up. So he had a church that was pretty active there in the summertime, but nobody pretty much in the wintertime for about 9 months. One day there was a town drunk, a guy who drank way too much and was an alcoholic, obviously. And he befriended my pastoral friend, befriended this guy. And they went out fishing one day. And they were in the Sound, and in this between Peaks Island and the coast of Maine, there are huge tides, and they're some of the biggest on the shore, and they rise up very suddenly. And so what happened? A great tide appeared, and it swept the boat, and they thought they were going to get the whole thing was going to fall into the water, and it was very, very scary. And my friend was a very good boatman and knew what he was doing and all that. So they didn't swamp, but nonetheless, so the drunken man looked at my friend and said, "Well, bet you had nothing to say about that one, did you, preacher? Where was God and all that?" And my friend responded to him, "Well, that's the beginning of prayer. Anger, frustration, mystery, surprise. For Job, I think that's the beginning of prayer. I think that's it. I think it starts there. It starts with this broad recognition that you just don't quite know all the time to whom you're speaking. You really don't. God is sometimes hidden, sometimes beyond, sometimes more than we can imagine, and we bring to that God everything that we've got, all the frustration, all the anger, all the confusion, all of that stuff. It comes to God in prayer. I mean, prayer becomes a hugely complex, vast array of emotion rather than just asking for stuff or whatever. Yeah. So I think I think that's where Job would go. I'm simply trying to mimic what I think Job would say to such a question. Is that helpful? Okay. Yeah, Kenny.
Well, I just want to focus on really the last few words of the entire book.
Mm-hmm.
That he, after all of this, he lived a lot of days, 140 years.
Mm-hmm.
And very significant to telling the story, he died.
Yep.
And so whatever the book means, whatever God's role, whatever God's meaning, it seemed to have taken with Job.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
He got the meaning, whatever it was, and he lived by it, it seems, and call it reward, call it whatever you want. He found his way through life in what appears to be a very positive way after that.
Yep. I absolutely agree with that.
And he died. Imagine if this story were left open-ended.
Oh yeah.
And the last saw of Job was he was, hanging out with his family around the fireplace somewhere.
Yeah. Right.
He left to wonder what happened next.
That's right. Now you know, don't you? And notice 140 years is interesting, isn't it? It's sort of twice 70.
Right.
The sort of usual length of a life in the Hebrew Bible, apparently. So it's twice that. He's dangling his great-grandchildren. He's got a whole horde of cattle and all kinds of stuff, and he's rich again and comfortable. And granted, if you hear that only as a kind of reward for praying or good behavior, something, I think that misses it. I think that doesn't help us much. But I absolutely agree, Kenny. On the one hand, the book ends like a good fairy tale would end. They lived together happily, and they died. That I think that's right. But it isn't open-ended. You're quite right. It's not. But I would still suggest, however, that the theology represented in the book is very open-ended. Job got something from it, and maybe what he got was he didn't know very much, but that was okay. That was okay. And, that may not be good for everybody. I mean, goodness gracious, I've spent my whole life trying to get answers to things. And so what Job has really continually taught me is that I'm not going to find answers to all these things. And that's okay. That's okay. As much as I wish I could get them, maybe I don't. Anybody else?
I would like to go back to Job's daughters for a moment and suggest that there is a very destabilizing and kind of revolutionary part of Job. And once you start to reject the traditional views of God as being the rewarder of good and the punisher of evil, and that major traditional foundation is set aside, it opens up Job to the suggestion that maybe some of the other traditions can also be set aside, including the traditions of excluding your daughters from an inheritance. And so in that regard, that little few verses is quite radical.
Yep, absolutely. I agree fully. Yeah. And that's why the world is new. It's a new world. I mean, I think what the little tale is trying to tell us at the end in these brief sentences here is that we cannot go back to the old stuff again. We cannot do this. Now, how many people in our own Christian experiences hang on to this view that if I do the right stuff, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be safe. I'm going to be protected. If I do the wrong stuff, God is going to be angry with me. And I mean, that is a ubiquitous notion among many, many modern Christians. Of course it is. It still is after all this time. And I think this author is really after that one. And then trying to open us up to new, fresh possibilities. So I absolutely agree with that, Reg. I think that's a lovely comment, and I think it's absolutely right. Anybody else? Yeah, Becky?
We can be progressive, but isn't this the same God that gave us the 10 Commandments?
Yeah.
And if we ignore the 10 Commandments and live for ourselves, we're going to be miserable.
Yep.
And I think that part of our faith and our trust in what the rest of the Bible says about God and about us is that doing the right thing is the right thing to do, whether it is in keeping with the law or in some cases civil disobedience. But life goes on, the universe goes on, but we're responsible for this little corner of the world, and it is important for us to do the right thing and to know what the right thing is.
Yep, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that.
It's
and I would say this too.
God doesn't care.
That's right. I would say one more thing, Nancy, and that is, you remember Job has made this point over and over again. It's just that he imagined he was supposed to get stuff from that. I helped the poor and the stranger and the widow and all the things the prophets told me to do. I did. And I sacrificed and I was protecting my children and all that stuff. Great family man, blah, blah, blah. And he expected to get good stuff. He didn't get good stuff. He got the ash heap instead. So you're absolutely right that the biblical tradition says over and over and over and over again in every way that it can, that you and I are responsible for the lives, our lives and the lives of those around us. Certainly we are. But we cannot expect thereby that we are going to get comfortable and rich and famous and all that stuff. It's just not likely to happen at all. And we know that. But how many of these modern fundamentalist Christians keep making this claim that if you follow what I believe and tell you what you should do, that you'll get rich and you'll get comfortable and you'll get a Cadillac or a Lexus or a Mitsubishi, whatever you're going to get. And that is just nonsense. And Job has been saying it's nonsense for 2,500 years, and it certainly still is nonsense now.
It's a little feeble way, though, that we try to control God.
Of course. Yep, absolutely. And certainly one of the things you learn from those speeches of God, you're not doing that. Not going to happen. If God creates Beomath and Leviathan, there's no controlling God by our behaviors. Not at all.
I wonder, the men who decided to put this book in the compendium, at what point did they have these arguments, let's not do this? Let's just eliminate Job from this book. And because it is such a question mark, and whether it helps our faith or hurts our faith, you know, to think that God is going to gamble, just the simple thing, he's gambling a righteous man with Satan. And that's how we learned this, in my case, 70 years ago or more. That's what I understood from the book. And why did God want to gamble with this righteous man? And it seemed unfair. So if I was choosing to put this book in this Bible, I would say no.
Well, very good. That's a good way of putting that, Phil. And I don't disagree with that in this sense. We don't have, of course, any notes from any kind of group of discussing what they're going to put in the Bible or not. The formation of the Christian canon was a slow process, basically mysteriously performed by a group of persons over hundreds of years. They chose books that they found helpful to them, primarily, as far as we know. And yet at the same time, they argue, we do have some records of some arguments about certain books, but this book was never argued about. And the reason it wasn't, as far as we can tell, is because they thought Moses had written it. And so you could not argue with that. The reason they thought that is because it was brilliant, because it was magnificent poetry, and only Moses would have been smart enough to do it. Now, of course, that's certainly not true. Moses didn't write this at all. But the books that really troubled them were the books where God is not mentioned at all. That troubled them. Song of Songs, for example. That was troubling. What are we going to do with that? But it got in there. Somebody found it helpful. Somebody found it useful.
Are we going to do that next week?
Wish we could. Another, a book, if I were going to vote on what was in the Bible, I would vote against Nahum anytime. Nahum is a terrible book. It's a book that says in 3 disgusting chapters, the only good Ninevite is a dead Ninevite, period. That's what Nahum says. It's a nasty book, but somehow it played a role for some community sometime.
That's why I think I've only read it once and I never reread it again.
That was enough. That was enough. Yeah. Once is certainly enough of Nahum, I think. Okay. Anything else? We have a couple of minutes, maybe. Anybody else? Well, all right.
Oh, I've got one more.
Oh, one more. Okay, go for it.
But it's such a big question.
Mm-hmm.
We'll probably have to talk about it into the night, John.
Probably so. Probably so. That's okay.
And that is the whole thing about creating Beomath and Leviathan,
Right.
and
Yeah.
creating
sure.
weal and woe.
Yeah, sure.
That's just not the holy, true, beautiful, good God I know.
No, that's exactly right. And I think many of us would say exactly that same thing, Diana. You would just say, gosh, if God is creating the darkness and evil of the universe, as Isaiah says, and as the Job's speeches seem to imply, then goodness gracious, this raises a horde of issues about the nature of God and who God is and how the universe is run and all that sort of stuff, which I think are just questions that are continually being asked and must continually be asked and not satisfactorily answered, only within limited ways of thinking that one has to open oneself up to perhaps a new way of thinking about God. The God of process, for example, might be a way of dealing with this, but nonetheless, that a traditional God is traditional ways of thinking about God are not going to solve that one. Just not. It's not. So I don't have any easy responses to that one. Nobody else does either, right?
The only other thing I want to say is, if you all want to thank John, give some money to the church.
Good idea. Good idea.
And write him a little email if you don't have his address. It's jholbert@smu.edu. Just write him a little note. It's always good to know that the seeds are.
Put that in the chat.
Okay, I'll do it right now.
Great.
And he has a birthday coming up.
I do. It's true. Thursday is my birthday.
You are a 75-year-old gift to us, John.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. I assure you, this is great stuff. The book of Job has been, as I've said from the very beginning, my leading light in the biblical tradition for over 50 years. And I have never tired of talking about it, wrestling with it, struggling with it. And I am a long way from being at the end. Somebody said that, this is the end of the book. No, it's not the end of the book. This is when things start. Reflection continues.
Well, we've so enjoyed you sharing your expertise.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for coming along and being, and I trust eventually someday we might even be together. Who knows? But at least this is a very good way to do it because it has people from all over the country, which is just marvelous. So thank you. Let's have a word of prayer then, and we'll be dismissed for this evening. Oh God, how grateful we are again for this community of faithful strugglers with your tradition and your truth and your reality. What we ask from you is your presence. Sometimes we don't see it easily, and sometimes we don't perceive it readily, but we trust that you are with us. And because that is so, we can live our lives in hope and in freedom and in joy and possibility. And as always, we are so grateful for the gifts you have given and for your life among us. We pray in your holy name. Amen. Thank you all. Thank you all. See you again sometime, I trust.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Very welcome. Very welcome.